in the world, so I ended up leaving them. I started the Android Alliance, which is now the GEG, that's the Android meetup for Philadelphia. Yeah. Okay. So, and then I worked for a consulting company, did a few apps there. Then I moved on to a startup. Then I did another consulting company. And then right now, as of April of this year, I'm on my own. I have a company with my husband, and I do the Android consulting. He does full stack backend stuff. And if you have anything interesting that needs help, let me know. But basically, I'm also working with a nonprofit called Kids on Computers, and we open up labs in emerging markets like Mexico and India and other places that need computing. And then I recently took on one contract with one of those companies, and then if you have anything interesting, that's question marks for those things, not sure. So, now we're going to talk about Fragments, just a high-level overview of history. So, like I said, in about the spring of 2011, I want to say February, but I don't know the exact date, Honeycomb came out. So this was a split in how things were done. Originally, it was just an activity, and activities meant everything, and now it's like, okay, great, tablets are huge, what are we going to do with that space? They came up with the idea of fragments. So fragments are this idea that you can encapsulate different set of logic in these little qubits in these different ways. They gave you a few options. Immediately, they gave you options to backward. Now we have also forward-looking backporting with the 13 and whatever. But if you use Honeycomb or higher, you can use fragments automatically. So like I mentioned, the whole point is that you have fragments and you can mix them and match them and do whatever you want. So if we look at, this is Mint, which is a money management app. So if you think about this, how would you break this up into fragments? Does anyone see a fragment here that they'd like to point out? Something that you might be able to break out?
Fee.
The fee, yeah. So we have, this is the overall spending. But here's the feed on the left, like that might make sense to have just on a phone by itself. Or this other side here, I'm not entirely sure what that is. There's a lot of things mixed together. It's all your accounts. And you might want to do something like the where did you buy this thing on the right-hand side. Like this could live on the phone by itself. So could this budget thing on the left. So you're probably familiar with the stats, but we'll briefly touch on some of them. So there's a lot of apps. And there's a lot of devices out there, and there's more and more devices shipping all the time. So this global shipments on the bottom, this isn't how many are total. This is how many are added per year. So we have 1 billion, 1.2 billion this year, and then it's projected to be 1.8 additional billion devices to be added in 2018. 80% of that is Android. And as you know, Google I/O, they announced a whole bunch of stuff. There's way more places to put Android. There's one system to rule them all, and basically using fragments can help you to better support all these different use cases. So right now, this is a nice number. I really like that we're only down to 12% of pre-Honeycomb. When I started giving this talk, it was 94% in May 2012. People just did not believe that tablets at all were going to make a difference. I think still a lot of people have that fear and belief right now. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And I've been giving this talk about every 6 months. It's that talk I really wish would become obsolete. I tried to obsolete it. I put these slides in retirement, but then he asked me specifically to come talk about fragments. So here we are talking about them again. And now May 2013, down to 44%. And then we were down to 28% last year, full year ago, and now we're at 12. So it just keeps going down. It keeps going down further and faster. I personally can't ignore the 12% because I care about global markets. So for me, I'm going to keep holding on to that for a while. And if you don't need to, you can cut them out, as others have suggested. Cool. So back then, there was a lot of business people that needed to be convinced that this needs to happen. They thought it was high risk, but our schedules, we need to ship all of these things. It's new, it's scary, let's not do this. So it was a really high risk, because this is what the picture looked like. I'm not sure exactly when I put this one in, but if you notice, it's mostly 1.5 up through 2, 3, 3, and then there's a little bit of 3 and 4 there, just a little bit. So this used to be high risk. It's not anymore. So I also made the point, well, you can invest and be thought leaders in the realm and keep knowledge go and actually lead the charge instead of just catching up later. Well, if you're not doing them now, you're just catching up later. We're probably more around this area. So we're not going to go too deep into what you can do with them and all the different APIs and stuff, but there are new APIs, new 3 years ago APIs. One of the nice things about Fragments is it allows you to break down your monolithic activities into something that is more manageable. I think that you are writing legacy code if you've never even considered having Fragments. Now, if you've tried Fragments and it's not meaning particular things and then you cut them out, that's great. But if you just never even considered ever writing them, you should catch them. And some of the ways you can do that, you can either throw everything out, write it all over again, not very practical. You could also start from here and continue doing it from this point on, and that's the easiest approach. That's the one I advocate for, because then you can go back and renovate the things you need to at the time you need to. You can also go back and do a full renovation. That's what we did at Comcast. And again, I think you should start from here. People still sometimes tell me that tablets won't catch on. You can pretend that there's no need ever to do this, but this is actually an old forecast, about a year old, and they were predicting that 70% of global chat market users will be Android by 2016. Well, according to Google I/O, we're already at 62% as of this year. So this isn't, so it might even be higher. It was 46% last year. This includes iPads, all of the tablets out there, all of them. 62% are Android. So are there any questions on this part before we move into like code? And if you have questions throughout, I'm fine with you just raising your hand and I'll address them. Cool. So you can think of Fragments as a sub-activity. So they're smaller activity bits. They have to be hosted by activity. Can't live on their own. They have a life cycle like activities. Can get kind of complicated. If you download these slides, and I'll post a link on Twitter later for them, basically this walks you through the activity and the fragment, how they all tie into each other, and some of the gotchas that people have figured out over the years. So let's talk about the fragment manager. Well, first, if you're defining fragments, you do it in XML like you do with normal views right now. It's just a fragment tag, and you give it the name, and then you go from there. If you wanted to do more of a dynamic thing where you're swapping things in and out, you'll typically have something like a holder, and then you'll use your fragment manager to put in new bits and things out management model. So to do that, you'll need transactions. That's where you add, replace, remove, whatever you're doing with it. At the end, you commit. And you can do transitions. Interesting things there as well. You got a backstack that you can use, just like you do with activities. And then now, back then, they strongly discouraged this, but now they have given you the option to put fragments and your fragments and your fragments. So in this example, I have F1 as a fragment, and then F2 and 3, and then 5 has two more inside of it. It's kind of crazy. But I personally stay away from this as much as I can. That generally is a sign that your UI is getting a little too complex and you can break it down and do better things. But some people actually need this. That's great. You want to keep your fragments separate. You don't want them to talk directly to each other. Use your activity as an intermediary between them. And then finally, there's things like figuring out who's showing what right now, and that can help you when you're figuring out, do I have a dual pane, or what should I do with this view right now? Now we're going to get into code, so if you have any questions on any of that stuff, let me know. So the idea here, if you haven't done them before, normally with the activities, you would just have my activity at the top left, and it would directly point to this welcome XML at the bottom. There would be no fragmenty things there. It would just be those two things. So you're adding a layer in the center, basically. So we start out with our activity. We still do the set content view as we've always done. This time we put it into a layout. I'm going to call it main. In that one, you have a fragment. So that fragment will be instantiated. You give it a fully qualified path. And then in your fragment, you inflate your view, and you tell it which XML file you're going to look at. So the one that it looks at is something more like you're used to doing with activities right now. basically that's how it's all wired together. And now we'll go through creating fragments from scratch. So you'll want to declare your layout. So here I have an activity welcome for a single thing. So I have one fragment in here, and I gave it the name of where it is, and I gave it an ID. I have the same file name for my dual pane, and using magic for the resource qualifiers and stuff and putting it in specific places. Because I have the same file name, it's going to pick out the right one for a dual pane depending on the things I have configured for it. That's a totally different thing. After that, you want to show your layout. So here you have the option between activity and fragment activity at the top. So I have a little selector thing. So if you choose activity, you need to be using Clean Common Hire. If you want to use the support library and integrate that into your project, then you're going to use fragment activity, which says I'm an activity, I have fragments. Okay. In case they do that so that you can clearly differentiate. Well, it's the same thing. And then you're going to do like you always do, set a content view, and those are the ones we already saw on the left. At some point, you're going to try and figure out whatever logic to handle whatever views you have, because you can't really generalize this because there's no true tablet, no true phone. You can have everything in between. It's whatever you think makes the most sense and whichever rotations and all the different things you can do. But let's say you ask, is this dual pane? Then you would have some sort of function that returns, doesn't have to be a function, but you would return something saying yes or no. And finally, you write your fragment. It's not hard, pretty familiar. So create a fragment. You can extend regular fragments, list fragments, preference fragments, or whatever you want, or different types. And then after you do that, so on create view there, that's a different function. It's not on create, but it's basically the same sort of thing that you do with activity, but now you're doing it on create view. You're going to inflate that layout, telling it which XML file that it's going to use. And from there, use layout dot find view by ID to actually get references to those views instead of like you would with an activity that is just find view by ID. And then you have your XML, which has whatever you want in it. And text views that hello world. Any questions on that? So I'm going to talk a little bit about this is really what inspired me to do this talk. It's such a complicated document trying to read through this and figure out what the heck was going on. So I made a flowchart that we're going to move through, and that's why I'm presenting instead of something more standard. But the idea is you're going to have two fragments in a tablet. You're going to have one fragment on your phone. And if you click on something in the tablet, then it's going to update instead of starting a new activity. And if you're on your phone, it's just going to start something new. And this is a parallel set of activities that only ever are used on the phone. Yes, they both appear a little bit, whatever, they're there. So they're only for the phone. So again, with the real life example, this master detail pattern looks more like this. So if you click on things on the left with the list fragment, it's going to update the details on the right. For the tablets, once you click on that button when you're happy, it'll take you to something new. Same thing with the phone, except that now that you're clicking on things and going to the details, to get back to that list, you have to get back out. And then you still have the same button there the same way. It's the same fragment in both. So now let's go chart. So we have our activity, it's going to create things, and it's going to figure out what it's running. So there's some magic that I mentioned. It's the resource qualifier system. You will do whatever you want to make the applications you want happen. So basically, it's going to figure out which XML should I be showing. What form factor am I? So here we're going to go to the tablet flow first. In this case, it's going to pull up our main XML. We're going back to the first code example there. Oh, sorry, no. This one's separate. 1 and 3 are related. This one is different. This is just the matching details. But we have a list fragment and a detail fragment. Now we show whatever basic view we decided is our basic view when we enter. At some point we're going to click on a list item, and that's going to update the view. So when we click on, when we do the on click, then we're like, okay, great, time to show detail. That show detail function is going to figure out whether or not we should update that activity based on whatever criteria, or should we start a new activity for a phone. So are we dual paying? That looks something like this. So in here we get a reference to our Fragment Manager. Again, if you're using the support library, then you're going to do get support Fragment Manager. Otherwise, you're just going to get Fragment Manager here. Find your fragment by ID, because you gave it an ID and XML. And then we figure out whether or not it's null, is it showing right now, whatever makes sense for you in particular. So in our case, we are dual paying. So then we update instead of opening a new activity, and it looks like this. When we click on, whenever you click on any of the list fragments, it's just going to update that view continually until you decide to click on the detail button, and it's going to do a click there, and then we're going to start a brand new activity. So that's the tablet flow. Now we're going to go to the phone. Any questions on that? Yes?
In the tablet case, you have a list fragment, and until the detail fragment is in white, for example, is not visible. What would you suggest to show that?
I mean, it really depends on what your app is, but maybe it makes sense to show the first item as the default. It just really depends what you're building. Any other questions? Great. Best slide ever. Totally makes sense. All right, so for the phone version, here we have just one fragment in our XML instead of two. And that's what it looks like. So same thing, if you click on a list view item, then we're going to see the detail information about it. But before that, we're going to say, okay, show me the detail. Then it's going to go, well, should I show or should I update? Am I dual paying? In this case, it's not dual paying. So we're going to go through and decide to start the detail activity instead. Now we have our brand new activity that only lives on the phone and never used by the tablet. In there, we do an onCreate. And then it calls this detail XML. And then there's no fragment. It's shown, and then we get the familiar thing here. Now, like I mentioned before, if you want to go back, you hit the back button. But in this case, we're going to move forward and go to click listener, which takes us to a brand new screen.
Question.
Yes.
How come you're not using dynamic fragments and just replace and let the fragment manager handle the backstack? Why are you using two activities? Is there a special reason for that?
So the question was, why am I using two activities and instead of doing it dynamically through the Fragment Manager? That's also straightforward. The reason why I'm doing it that way is because I was literally translating the Google Crazy Doc into pictures, and this is what they were advocating. But it's possible. You can manage it all sorts of ways. I just like to use the resource system myself, so that's why I like XML when I can.
Yes, no, I have no problem with that part. I'm just wondering why you're using that. Good enough.
Yeah, no problem. Any other questions, comments? Cool, so if you're taking an app right now that is all activities and you want to massage them into fragments, this is a general framework for how you might go about doing that. So instead of, well, depending, you might just be updating your SDK if you're just going to use the activity, your SDK level. But if you're going to use the support library, then you're going to need to change it to fragment activity for your activity right now. So it looks like this. You import the fragment activity, and then you send that to the activity. It's pretty straightforward. Then I copy all that code, and then I dump it into my new fragment. So basically, I have welcome fragment, send fragment, has all the random fragment activity. This is not going to build for most of the steps of this. So then I swap out the onCreate for an onCreate view. Another small change. Fairly easy. We're going to inflate the XML. Now, the XML that used to be for your activity is now going to be the same one you'll want for your fragment, and you're going to have to write a new one for your activity. So basically, whenever you do this step, you just swap it, the set content view, for instead of an inflate. You want to keep that same X amount. Then you use layouts to find views by ID. So once you've inflated it, instead of find views by ID, you don't layout out. And then we want to set up our activity view. So here's where we have our fragment activity. We're setting the content view to our new activity underscore welcome, X amount. That's what this might look like. It has a fragment inside of it. And depending on how many you want to create, you just keep doing that. And then this is step 7, but who knows how many steps this is actually going to be. This is the meat of doing it, which there's a lot of complications around taking a humongous monolithic activity and turning it into fragments. You're going to want to disentangle your logic. You're going to want to extract out stuff. You're going to move the management of all of the fragments into your activity, and then so there's going to be a lot of work related to that, and you'll want to refactor, of course. And you either choose to do the support library or you don't. Up to you. So in theory, there's like 7 steps, but it's probably more like 50 or 100 steps there. So it's a huge pain to go back and fragmentize your app instead of just writing it from the front with one fragment at a time. Even if you don't need it right now, what does it hurt? Nothing, because then you can reuse them later. So instead of doing this, just create it. Your next activity you can have. You don't even need to get approval from tech leads or whoever's running the company. So what? Just do it. It's a gift. You're gifting them something. And just find them in code review if things like that. So you may have heard recently, if you follow the blogosphere, that Square is anti-fragment. That's cool. They've been playing with fragments for a very long time. They have an informed opinion. I respect that. I think that if you're starting out with fragments, you should actually use them first and then see where they go and how they create problems for you and then go from there. So I think that it's really important to try and use fragments, understand, and do tablets, and yeah, not where I was going with that. But basically, do fragments. Please help me not give this talk anymore. I don't want to give it anymore. Any questions? Yes.
We just because we do use the fragments, and fragments are good. But a quick question: you can perform similar what the fragments are doing, but with help of views. How would you define? Why would you use fragment over views? Main points.
It's always like very flexible, where you would draw the line between what should be a view, because you can do a lot of this stuff with views, what should be a fragment. So what I usually do is if it's just going to be a little view widget, then maybe I'll create a view. Also, if I want to just show and hide a section or something if I want. I mean, it's really hard to answer that question. It just depends on what I'm doing. When I look at a thing, then I draw pictures and boxes around stuff and then start breaking it down and figure out should it be a fragment. Doesn't make sense to have all this behavior and view stuff mashed together, or should I break it up into separate things? Just depends. Yes?
Yeah, in the version where we had the phone version, so after clicking on the list item, you actually start a new activity, right? Why would we reuse the fragment which we actually use on tablets?
You can do that with the dynamic fragment management stuff and swap it out if you had a holder. And then, yes, why did you start a new activity for the fragment? Mostly because this is the way that Google was advocating in this blog post here, but basically you can create a holder and then swap out those 2 fragments if you wanted to. It might make the logic more complex. Trying to think. I don't know. There are infinite paths forward. I'm not someone who thinks that it has to be this way only ever. So, yes.
How long do I have to keep using the fragment support library?
I want it to die as well.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah.
Always. The reason is that the fragments and the support library will get updated. The ones in the framework will never, so it will run old code. And shit.
Oh, that's a good point.
Is there an example of something that they've changed?
Yes.
What
Child fragments. They're totally bugged out on the framework, but have been for a while. But they're much more stable using the support library.
All right.
Also, it allows you to export your application to older things. You should care, Tumblr. You should care about everyone in the world. Seriously. Anyone else? Yes.
Yeah. So against fragments in a way. Well, not against the concept of them. I use views as fragments, like more like what Square advocates.
Do you actually use like Mortar and Flow and stuff?
No, I don't.
So you're just creating
Like
custom
views
views
and
using
then
them.
custom objects for like view controllers. Just pretty much the input.
So you're creating your own like
Yeah,
flow
so-
management system for that?
Well, it depends on the view stuff, more or less. I like that more because the fragments. So how do you handle like transitions and stuff really? Because fragment transitions are such a pain. Because when you add them, the view isn't there yet, so you have to like listen to hierarchy changes before you can start animations, and it just makes stuff a pain, in my opinion.
To each his own. So I haven't done as many like fancy animations throughout the app that usually ends up getting cut because they really want everything, and we're like, well, you can have everything, but that's going to take another month, and they say, well, forget the animation. That's nice that you do. So his point was, if you use views, you get a lot more as far as view animations go. But there is some complications around it in that you have to write your own stuff to manage that. So there's some framework stuff that supports you if you do fragments, and if you do the views, then you have to manage it yourself. So just depends whatever makes sense for your company. But again, before you completely discard them, like some people have done, then yeah, use them. Anything else? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm surprised that nobody made the obvious sort of thinking fragment, but that's just me. It's partly me and your uncle that Corey is doing this fragment approach. There are a lot of other really